Hi, everyone, and thanks for taking the time to join us today. We've got a great webinar in store for you. Today's topic is on creating content for millennials, why it's important, and strategies for success. My name is Liam Maroney. I'm the Demand Generation Manager and one of the many millennials here at NewsCred, and I'll be moderating today's webinar for you. Your hosts today will be Joe Puglisi from BuzzFeed and Marcus Stoll from NewsCred. Just to give you some quick background on your hosts, Joe is the Director of Creative Strategy at BuzzFeed. He has extensive experience in content creation, marketing, and distribution across various social platforms. Over the past 3 years, he's collaborated with and created social content strategies for brands like Geico, GE, and Pepsi. His work has been nominated for at least 2 Digiday Awards. And on a personal note, Joe lives in New York City and spends his spare time doing karaoke, running long distances, and thinking about what might happen at the end of Game of Thrones. Marcus is the head of marketing for Europe, Middle East, and Africa at NewsCred, based out of our London office. In his year and a half at NewsCred, he's played a significant role in the development and execution of the company's content marketing efforts and demand generation programs across all stages of the buyer cycle. On another note, Marcus didn't actually supply me with any fun facts about himself, so I'll have to fill in that gap. He has tremendous hair, and you can take that from me personally. It is absolutely glorious. Anyway, just to get some quick housekeeping tips out of the way, the webinar is set to last about 40 minutes, and at the end, we'll be answering some of your questions. If you want to ask a question, please do so at any stage during the webinar, and we'll bring them up at the end. And of course, don't forget to join in the conversation on social using the hashtag ThinkContent and the handles at BuzzFeed and at NewsCred. So now that we've gotten the logistics out of the way, I am delighted to turn the webinar over to the first of your hosts, Marcus Stoll.
All right, thank you, Liam. Wow, what an introduction. I have to say I'm very thankful that this is a webinar, so I don't have a number of hundreds of people judging the truthfulness of that statement about my hair. But I appreciate the intro, Liam, and really excited to be presenting today. So before we jump in, I got 40 some odd slides. It's going to be about 15, 20 minutes-ish before I toss it back over the fence, over the Atlantic, really, to Joe. It's going to be fast, it's going to be furious, it's going to be educational, so buckle up and hopefully we can have some fun as well. But yeah, kicking it off, we've all heard the word millennial and it's kind of on every brand's mind. Any brand you talk to nowadays is really talking about how they need to fix their strategy to be able to effectively target millennials. Used to be just marketers thinking about it, and now realistically, it's everyone at a brand that talks about the importance of engaging millennials and talking to millennials and figuring out kind of that solution. They're going to be tomorrow's leaders, tomorrow's influencers, and tomorrow's big spenders. And in a lot of cases, as you'll see, they're already those things today. But let's jump right in without further ado so we can get this thing moving. Full disclosure, this webinar is being hosted by 2 millennials. Both Joe and I are millennials. I'm sure many of you out there are millennials listening. And as Liam mentioned, NewsCred is a company and BuzzFeed is a company as well. Tend to have a lot of millennial employees. So a lot of experience here, a lot of thoughts, a lot of input, and hopefully you enjoy our takeaways from this session. And the sad truth before we really get going is that we aren't all that impressed with what's going on today in content marketing. Brands really have their work cut out for them. We have our work cut out for us, but there's a massive opportunity with this market to be able to create effective, engaging content and really get them to start sharing it. Millennials as a group call BS faster than any other audience. They consume a lot, but they do have really short attention spans. Everyone's heard that stat about attention span shorter than a goldfish. So I don't know how true that is, but definitely, you want to take that into account when creating content. And as well, they like to laugh, show emotion, be culturally relevant, and then they're independent as well, or at least we want you to think that. But, let's jump right into the agenda. So I'll kick it off with what is a millennial and why do they matter to brands today, then talk about the current state of marketing to millennials. So I'm going to kind of set the stage, a lot of stats, a lot of research about why it's important and different things to consider. And then, like I said, I'll kick it over to Joe to talk about what BuzzFeed's formula is for creating effective content, and then he'll also talk about what makes good content and then things to consider when creating it. And then we'll hit on a bit of Q&A at the end, and really excited to have BuzzFeed here because they're probably the one name more popular than millennials that you see across the internet nowadays. So I'm sure you all can't wait for Joe's section, and really excited to have him with us here today. So what is a millennial and why do they matter? Most of the stats you'll see in the presentation are from a late 2014 survey that we did at NewsCred. And then we'll toss in some insights from some other sources here and there. If you're interested in checking out the survey, it's on our academy on newscred.com, and we'll also be sure to send out the link after the webinar in case anyone wants to take a look at that. But kind of the gist of what it comes down to is that in today's world, there's been a fundamental shift in the way that we create, consume, and share content. The quantities you see on the right-hand side are really insane and hard to believe, and I had to verify these numbers, research them a couple of times before I truly believed them, but they are accurate. And so, every single day, hundreds of millions, if not billions of pieces of content, depending on what you're talking about, are being shared. So, there's this kind of huge haystack of content out there. And a lot of times from a brand, specifically when trying to target millennials, it feels like your stuff's kind of the needle in the haystack and you have trouble getting found. So hopefully over the next few slides and then Joe's sections as well, you'll learn how to stand out a little bit, especially with that millennial audience. Jumping right into what a millennial is and kind of what it means to marketers. Millennials, also commonly known as Generation Y, range multiple definitions out there, which makes it a bit tricky to fully identify, but the common understanding is anywhere from 1982 throughout the early 2000s. So this is a pretty wide gap. Generally looks at people anywhere from 30, 35 years old. So it's a pretty huge audience and not really one that's efficient for marketers to look at. So what does it mean to marketers when we talk about millennials? Basically, we tend to view that common understanding as 18 to 25 years old. And that can flex up a little bit. So you'll also see 21 to 30 is another typically referenced range there. And we typically look at these as the type of people that can't live without technology. They're on their smartphones all the time, have those short attention spans, and they have a little bit different view of the world than previous generations just because of the time that they've grown up in with that technology. So some examples of influential millennials, and you'll have to excuse my crude cutouts here. I'm far from a designer, but they'll only be up for a few minutes, I promise. So kind of on the front end, you have people like your Zuckerbergs from Facebook and Evan Spiegel from Snapchat, the business founders, CEOs, really influential people from a business standpoint that are millennials in today's day and age. And you'll see some other company logos coming up about some other examples of massive, some of the most influential companies in the world that are being run by millennials today. Next we have, I don't know if anyone will recognize this, but Malala Yousafzai, who's the actually youngest ever nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. She focused on promoting education for young girls in her home of Pakistan and then was famously attacked by the Taliban. And now she's built up this incredible platform to speak about human rights and, like I said, specifically education for young women in her group. But absolutely a millennial and absolutely someone who's massively influential on the world stage. And then all the way down to your content creators. I don't know if people recognize this photo, but it goes by the name of Jerome Jarre. And a lot of people just know him as kind of that French guy across the social platforms. Over 8 million followers on Vine, over 1 million on Twitter, YouTube, and Instagram. And every Snapchat that he posts gets multiple millions of views. It's pretty insane. And just give you a little taste for how brands are now flocking to target this millennial audience. They pay him supposedly about $30,000 for a single Vine or a Snapchat for him to create and then push out to his audience. And we're really kind of, as content marketing, we believe that long term that's not really an effective strategy. You want it to kind of be coming from you and on your properties. So hopefully over the next few slides you'll pick up some tips and tricks on how to do that. And before we get there, just 2 quick wrap-ups on the influential side. So I promised a few more companies. These are just some more examples of companies that are either founded or run by millennials. So it's a really drastic change kind of on the historical viewpoint of things, of companies being run by people in their 50s or 60s. And then this last one, I don't actually have a follow-up photo for this because I just wanted to reflect the fact that any one of us, I could be any one of you, any millennial out there, to be the next person that has influence. With today's social media and all the platforms, all it takes is one tweet or one post to really go viral, or a consistent stream of quality posting, which isn't that hard to do, as you'll see. in order to become that next influential millennial. So just to wrap it up, just wanted to kind of throw that out there that really it's up to anyone to kind of take that next step and be that next influential millennial. So wrapping this section up before we get into the current state of marketing about why millennials matter. 82 million content consumers in the US alone on a monthly basis are millennials. That's a massive statistic when you consider the US as a whole is only a little bit over 300 million people. 85% of them and more are smartphone users, and I'm sure you've all seen or heard the stat about how many hundreds of times every day people look at their smartphones on average, and I'm sure millennials are even higher. So a lot of opportunities and a lot of viewage through those smartphones for millennials. Spending power. They'll have $1.4 trillion in spending power by 2020. So as I mentioned, they're going to be tomorrow's big spenders as far as what they're buying from brands and what they're looking to purchase. And then 83% of them connect with a brand on social media. So again, this is a huge opportunity. They're connecting with us today, but they're not necessarily sharing and engaging with our content. So what can we do to change those things? And this is where it starts to get juicy, statistics and updates. But what's the current state of marketing to millennials? Only 6% are influenced by online advertising. So these banners, pop-ups, people just don't share that stuff, specifically millennials. 45% of millennials don't find content compelling enough to share. We have the power to change this. We need to avoid that broad focus of just putting out batch and blast type of content and really get specific to millennials and their interests and what they care about. And only 32% find brand communications helpful today. We really need to focus on whatever piece of content we put out, helping people to be a better worker, be more productive, be happier, be healthier, whatever it is, we need to be more helpful. Simple as that. So why isn't your content winning the hearts of millennials everywhere? Got 5 kind of big bucket reasons with some good stats to go along with it, but your demographics are too broad, and even just thinking about this question from the terms of a millennial demographic, we're already too broad. Over 50% of millennials respond positively to content that caters to their age, location, and cultural interests. So we need to get as specific as possible. We need to identify why they care, but we should stop looking at millennials as a whole and start to look at demographics such as women aged 22 to 25 that live in Brooklyn, that listen to a specific band, that shop at Forever 21, for an example. The more specific we can get, the more individualistic we can get, specifically with millennials, we're going to see a lot of success, and we need to be relevant. We aren't being useful or helpful, so I hit on this a little bit last slide, but 64% of millennials respond positively to content that's useful to them, and they'll be more likely to share it. And then you see the stat down here at the bottom that 31% say they're more likely to buy if you provide something that teaches them something. With over 5,000 marketing messages a day going in front of millennials, they're obviously going to ignore the stuff that doesn't provide any value to them. So you need to figure out that niche, that pocket where your brand can live and present value to a millennial that you can then push out and then that they're going to share. And finally, like one of the things we look at NewsCred is hitting one of your kind of 3 core business goals when reaching millennials. So ours are inspire, educate, and entertain. So if you're creating a piece of content and you realize that you're not hitting one of those 3 objects, and again, that's inspire, educate, and entertain, then you need to kind of hit the reset button on that piece of content and start over. Because at the end of the day, it's not going to be something that gets shared if you don't hit one of those points. Third, your content is boring and stupid. Harsh words, but the truth in a lot of cases, unfortunately. So you don't want these words associated with your brand for obvious reasons. You want a positive reflection on your brand via thoughtfulness and then people sharing your content. 41% of millennials said the main reason they abandon content is that it's too long. At the same time, we shouldn't abandon long-form content. You don't have to go straight to listicles and short-form tweets and videos and things like that, but just don't make your long-form content a marketing ploy. Don't talk about your brand. Talk about experiences or, like I said, how to make their lives better. You want to form a perspective and a point of view for your brand and stick to it, and that's really critical with millennials to build up that level of trust. I thought this was a funny example when I was actually doing some of my research from Digiday about how they approach this kind of boring and stupid content piece. But you see on the left side this green TLDR on button. For those of you that don't know what that means, it's a term made popular by the kind of sometimes infamous site Reddit but it means too long, didn't read. So when you initially come to the site, the article appears in its long form version, with multiple paragraphs and images and things like that. But if you want, you can click this button on the left-hand side, and it just puts it right down to a headline and 1 or 2 sentences that kind of give you a feel for the article. So they're coming up with a little bit of an innovative solution to that problem about millennials not wanting to read content and people in general not wanting to stick around for content that's not going to be super useful to them. But hopefully, by creating that useful content, we can avoid things like this. Fourth, you haven't changed your delivery methods. Millennials have essentially been posting to social platforms straight out of the womb. Obviously, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but the truth is there's a ton of platforms out there, and preferences as far as where people are posting change very, very rapidly. So, where it might have been Facebook a few years ago, now from a B2B standpoint, you might look at Twitter, or if you're a retailer or a fashion brand, Instagram might be your platform of choice. So you really have to look at this from a standpoint of what are your business goals, and what do you think or what do you know that your target audience is involved on? And then finally, your content doesn't evoke emotion. I'm sure you like to laugh, millennials do too. Laughter, happiness, sadness, these are all emotions that people relate to when you push out content. Millennials want to connect with content. So if you continually start to push out content that has an emotional connection or an emotional theme to it, over time, they're going to start associating that emotion to your brand. And associating that emotion to your brand is really one of the best ways to build up trust with the content that you're creating. So again, you need to think about what's your greater brand purpose. Is it promoting hope? Is it promoting happiness? But you need to consistently keep that in the back of your mind whenever you're creating those pieces of content. So millennials are going to share content building off that emotion piece when it's a cause that they believe in, it's thought-provoking, and it's funny, and you can see the relevant percentages here. So 50% are going to share it when it's a cause that they believe in, 60% are going to share it when it's thought-provoking, and then 70% of it are going to share it when it's funny. So again, you want to connect with people on that emotional level. So where does that leave us? It's about time that we change up our approach. We have to change our approach in order to be successful. This old way that's been around for quite a long time from a brand standpoint of being brand-led, talking about ourselves and our products is no longer the way to go. The ad campaigns where we put a lot of money behind an effort and push that out, that's kind of gone by the wayside. And then focusing on those big level demographics again is something else that we don't want to focus on anymore. So where does that leave us? That puts us smack dab in the new way. So we want to be value driven. Like I said, we don't want to talk about ourselves. We want to drive value, be useful to people, make their lives better, just give them stuff that they can actually have takeaways from. We want to give always on content instead of the campaign approach. Campaigns are still useful to drive spikes in traffic. However, the kind of always on approach, the consistent quality publishing is a much more effective way to bring people back to your site. And then we want to get as close to the individual as possible. So again, avoiding those demographics and thinking about those 22 to 25-year-old women in Brooklyn who listen to a certain band and shop at Forever 21. We want to get as specific as possible because ultimately that's what's going to allow us to create that specific content. And I know that's hard, but at the same time, creating content for everyone resonates with no one. So we need to make sure we think about the specific people that we're going after when we create that content. And then before I toss it over to Joe, I just wanted to really quick hit on a couple of case studies about brands that we see doing it right. And you'll find expanded versions of this in the full report that we have. But first is going to be Netflix. So they promote some of their exclusive programming via targeted shareable content. And an example of that is the second season launch of Orange is the New Black, where they had an interactive Twitter event, created a custom hashtag for one of the most popular characters on the show. And then they also had a mobile app that was filled with shareable content as well. So they did this basically 1 week before the launch of season 2, and what they find, so 98,000 social mentions, 98% of which were positive, which is pretty much an unheard of number. And that quarter, Netflix actually passed 50 million overall subscriptions, which the CEO and CFO actually attribute to this campaign that they launched for Orange is the New Black. So it's just a good way to connect with millennials and promote brand awareness and get people to connect with the things that you're brand stands for and not your product itself. Next up, Verizon. So this is a really interesting one. The millennial generation cares about sustainability, equality, animal rescue, so on and so forth. And 37% of millennials are receptive to cause marketing, and expanding that out even further, they've said that 37% are more likely to purchase from brands that are like doing good things around content marketing. So this is really important. And Verizon had a really interesting campaign called Inspire Her Mind that focused on the disparity between women and men in math and science programs. And you see on the right-hand side that a lot of them say they're interested on it, but then not a lot of them end up doing it. So they created a sequence of advertisements and content pieces that ended up having results of, in the video specifically, over 1.3 million views in its first few weeks. And companies like Slate, Huffington Post, and Adweek commended the video ad, calling it thought-provoking, important, and a blast of refreshing cool air. So really focusing on these cultural themes has really been a success for Verizon, and something that you can apply to your brand as well. And then finally, Vice, one of my favorite examples. So there's a great quote here from Eddie Moretti, their chief content officer, about how millennials have lost trust in politicians, experts, and systems, and that's basically over the last decade. It calls it the liberation of information, which is kind of made possible now by all the social media channels. And millennials sometimes get this reputation of being self-indulgent selfie takers, but Vice found that when they engaged in direct conversations with their fans, that they do care deeply about the world they live in, and we're looking for a non-traditional source to keep them informed, which is now where Vice has found their niche. You know, they produce very long-form content about issues that matter to the world today, and they see a ton of success with that, especially around the millennial audience. 61% of their viewers on their website are millennial traffic, and they have over 6 million YouTube subscribers, publishing up to 1 new video a day, which is pretty outstanding considering the fact that a lot of their videos are 5, 10, 15 minutes long, not super short form 30-second minute clips like a lot of the news outlets out there today. So just some closing thoughts. Just wanted to point out that based off our research, almost 50% of millennials are reading what brands are pushing out most of the time. They're just not sharing it. So, you've seen some things that you can do by getting specific and making your content useful to them, and putting it about things that they care about is going to help that content get shared. But almost 50% of millennials are looking at this every time, so that's a really useful stat. And then where they're engaging with brands, of course, you have the social media channels, as we mentioned before, but perhaps more importantly, company website, which I think really rings the bell for the importance of content marketing. As a brand, you should be putting your content front and center on your website. Whether or not it's on your homepage or an easy link off your homepage to get to useful content, you should be doing it. And it's one of the best ways to get people back to your site, re-engaging with your content, and continuing on the journey with your brand. And then last slide, and then I'll throw it over to Joe here. Just utilize a mix of content and then scale those efforts up. So have custom content that's on brand stories and recipes, not about your brand, but with your tone of voice and themes in mind. Use licensed content. So third-party information is a phenomenal way to build credibility on cadence and keep your volume up. And then finally, social content. So you want to break the stuff up into bite-sized, snackable pieces that people can quickly engage with and then move forward with to engage with your brand. So with that, I'm going to toss it over to Joe to talk about BuzzFeed's formula and what makes good content and what you should think about when creating it. So Joe, take it away.
Thanks so much, Marcus. I find myself really wishing that I could also see this glorious hair that everyone's talking about, but I'll just have to use your headshot and my imagination. Hi, everyone. I'm Joe, Director of Creative Strategy over at BuzzFeed. Got a lovely intro, so let's just jump right into it. Wanted to level set for a second and just talk about how BuzzFeed has evolved, because I think it's very indicative of the way that we think about creation, and the way that BuzzFeed is organized is ultimately around the idea that sharing is the most important currency you can have when creating content. And so everything we do is really to get that share. So when you think about BuzzFeed and the way that we've evolved as a company, you know, experimentation is a really huge part of what we do. And we love the test and learn model. We love to put things out there, see how they perform, and see what we can learn from them. And we've been doing that for a number of years. So you can see the journey to date. You know, we have BuzzFeed proper, which is known for cute cats and gifs of people falling down the stairs. But we've evolved to a bunch of different siloed content organizations that focus on different things that we think people really care about. The underlying current through all of this is technology, and I can't stress this enough. You know, BuzzFeed is great at creating stuff, but what really powers BuzzFeed as a content creation engine is the technology behind it, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later in this journey. So what began as an experiment in 2006, and you could see what BuzzFeed used to look like, became BuzzFeed today. Like I mentioned, all these different silos, and they're really focused on individually crafting what makes that type of content interesting to people, and they're sort of loosely arranged around distribution channels, but also interests. And you'll see a running theme in today's BuzzFeed content point of view that interest marketing is really important. So BuzzFeed, content, technology, you get it. We are not just a content hub, but we're also a technology company. And the under the hood, you'll see there's a lot of interesting dev and technology that goes into what we do as an organization. So we've grown a lot. I don't need to harp on these numbers. You can see them for yourself. Crazy growth for BuzzFeed, and everyone probably wants to know, you know, how do we do that? And I think it starts with the content, and it starts with the content model and how it's powered. So when you think about the creation of content, you know, it kind of loosely follows a pattern of testing and learning, right? But what does that actually mean, and what does it look like? So we have a little visual here for you. You know, when you're thinking about creating, you're creating the content, right? You're distributing it, and then you also are measuring the impact, and that's kind of the content cycle. But the other side of that, and the part that I think BuzzFeed does really well, is data collection. You know, how do we build the technology to power that, and the talent, right? The talent needs to be there. So when you look at the cycle of content creation, it looks a little bit more like this. We create something, we distribute it through own properties, and we measure the impact. And this cycle is powered by the technology behind BuzzFeed owned platforms, the data we can collect both on and off site, and then of course the talent of our editorial staff to go beyond the cycle, go beyond the numbers, and just feel, you know, what is an interesting topic or trend that people are going to want to talk about. So when we're thinking about the philosophy of creating BuzzFeed content, it's important to think about the feed and the idea of the feed. So millennials live in the feed, right? We're trying to meet them there with our content. So creating stuff for BuzzFeed.com is important. And when you look at the referrals to BuzzFeed-owned properties, you can see these are pretty big numbers, right? 349 million from Facebook, 60 million from Pinterest, 12.5 million from Twitter. That's great. But looking at this a different way, the impressions that we have are massive, and the reach that we have is massive, and we're not maximizing this reach if all we're trying to do is drive back to one destination. So we've adopted a new way of thinking about having a bigger impact to people who see BuzzFeed content. And right now, we're pushing people back to the content through links out in the stream, and that's, you know, a good chunk of people seeing the content. But look at all the people that aren't clicking because it doesn't make sense to be experiencing that link in that environment. So the new way of thinking now, don't just push back to content, push content out into the stream. And if you do this, you can have a significantly larger impact on people where they're experiencing things. So if we look at BuzzFeed Classic, right, people making stuff moves through our vertical integration of proprietary technology and all the stuff that we're doing, learning, measuring, et cetera, and it finally makes it to the BuzzFeed site. But what this doesn't allow for is pushing out to other more disparate networks where we may not have as much control over the cycle of data, but we can, through partnerships and through you know, just testing and learning, have a bigger impact. So instead of pushing through our own vertical integration, we're now thinking about more of a network integration model where we have people making stuff, the talent using the technology we've built to create things, they're pushing content to different distribution channels that may be BuzzFeed owned, like web properties or apps, or maybe other social networks where we feel like people are experiencing content, you know, the Instagrams and Vines of the world, and we're pushing content out and hopefully getting some data back. We're learning about what's working, you know, the dress, our news app, and the Obama video that we made. There's some examples of content moving in different distribution channels, and then hopefully we can get some money back as well. And so we're using these networks not as something that we want to have rigid control over, but in places where people are actually using and experiencing content, there's so much more to learn if you open up to testing and learning in places you may not have that control over. So that's a lot of marketing and business speak, but I'm sure everybody's here because they want to know quite simply what makes good content, and what's the BuzzFeed philosophy. And before all the numbers and data influence us, before we think about all of the, you know, testing and learning, it really starts from a very simple place. You'll see a lot of different versions of this, I think, now, from different content producers and publishers who are essentially saying the same thing. You know, we've really learned and figured out that it comes down to three very distinct qualities in every piece of content, and they don't all have to be there in every piece of content, but you should have a good combination of these things, and you probably have heard them before from a BuzzFeed person speaking in public if you've ever seen it. We use it all the time. It's simple, but it's powerful. Identity, emotion, and information. So write those down. So identity, you know, when we're talking about millennials and the way that they use content as conversation, and when you think about it, content is meant to start, join, or create conversations, right? So if we're trying to inspire people to use content as a conversation, reflecting on their identity is a good starting point. And so identity is one of the core tenets of what has made BuzzFeed content so popular. You craft something that people really see as an extension of themselves. They use it to project their own self-image on social. So when we're talking about an identity like being a 20-something or being a 20-something in Los Angeles versus New York, I liked when Marcus said that when you try to market to everyone, you basically are marketing to no one. This is extremely true when you're creating content that's supposed to be interest-driven. Being from the United States, for example, is not a niche enough identity to activate people unless there's another level of interest. So being from a specific city is. And when we layer on something like an age range, we can speak effectively to these people in the way that they speak to each other with content. So identity is a great starting point, but I really think emotion is the key anchor for most content. And just visually seeing something like a dog hugging a person, or really the person hugging the dog, but the image evokes enough that you can get an entire story out of it. And we know that the digital space can be very visually driven. BuzzFeed certainly is a very visually driven medium. And so everything that we do needs to have the emotional punch and resonance of an image like this. And information, you know, it's simple and elegant, but people forget that if you make information interesting, it's inherently extremely shareable. Boring facts and figures certainly are not going to excite people to share your content, but if you're telling them something surprising, if you're telling them something that speaks to an identity or elicits a strong emotional reaction, like when you finally realize that you've been peeling bananas the wrong way your entire life, as I did, and I was devastated, then you're going to share that content as an extension of I'm a little smarter now, or you've got to know this immediately. So those are all good tips and tricks, and you can really follow this and create something great, but where BuzzFeed has taken it to the next level is taking that talent and using some of the technology that we've built to measure and optimize. And here are some of the ways that BuzzFeed thinks about creating content kind of under the hood. So you can see we have our own content management system that we've built to create things, and it was built in the idea that we'd be creating very visually driven list content, but this is the same content management system that our journalists use, and anyone who's writing content for BuzzFeed.com platforms is going to use this, and we're constantly refining it so it's up to par with what we think would create the best piece of shareable content. We also have a preview, of course, of what it might look like on the live site, but a key differentiator here is the consideration for mobile. Our dev team forces us to look at how the post will look on a mobile device before we can even see how it looks on the web device, because mobile is so important to our ecosystem. You know, over 60% of our traffic is on a mobile device, and if our content doesn't look good there, then we have to reevaluate. So a key differentiator there is think about, you know, how is this going to look on mobile? Does it function? Does it work? Is it consumable? Make it easy. And we're also thinking about, like I said before, how is this going to look in stream, and how can we create a better experience? You know, tell stories in the stream. So we like to look at how our list content is being shared in the stream, and how it will show up, how the images will show up. We can recrop and resize and plug into the various social networks to make sure that the experience is as seamless and uniform as it can be in these environments. And we're also doing quite a bit of optimization, both on and off-site with targeted promotion. You know, we're testing headlines and thumbnails, and there's a number of services that can do this for you. But one of the things that BuzzFeed has been able to do is build all of this kind of from the ground up into their system. And so, you know, we consider it to be almost key to any successful content marketing we're doing for a partner. We have to be testing and learning, not just on the creation of the content and pitting pieces of content against each other to see which one is best, but even on one individual piece, what's the best headline and thumbnail for that piece to get the best result. And when you're creating content, you should also be considering, you know, what's the life cycle of this piece of content, and then where am I going to really heavy up on conversation and promotion? And so when you think about different social networks and how those communities function, you know, we're constantly thinking about, is this piece of content going to play well on Facebook? If so, you know, there's about a 2-week life cycle there. Is it going to play well on Twitter? Because that is mere hours of relevance. YouTube is maybe the first couple of days is most important, but you got about a week. Pinterest could be almost 3 months. So when you're creating things and thinking about your distribution strategy, you know, you also have to be thinking about the staying power of your content. Is it timely? Is it supposed to be big impact quickly? Or is it meant to be more evergreen, more of the always-on mentality that you're constantly creating a baseline of content? So we also have a dashboard, and this is kind of dashboard 1.0. The red that you see there is people coming into this piece of content through sharing, and that's what we really want. That's like the juicy, the like fatty part of the steak that everybody loves and you go for, and it makes it really good. The blue is just us seeding the content out at BuzzFeed.com. As you can see, we can track inbound links to see where the sharing is really happening, and you know, 2 new versions of this one are coming out soon. One is a video dashboard, so we can do the same, essentially the same functionality for tracking who's sharing the video content. And we're also developing a technology called Pound. I encourage you guys to look it up because I don't want to get into too much detail to save time for questions. But Pound essentially can track the different trees of sharing. So here you just see inbound links, and it doesn't really tell you where the influence is, but Pound will be able to make a 3D model of people sharing, so we could definitively say, you know, maybe only 4,000 people came in from Pinterest, but one of those Pinterest shares drove all 13,000 of the StumbleUpon shares, and we would know that Pinterest is actually more influential than StumbleUpon for this specific content. So I hope you were paying attention before when this acronym was explained to you, but the too long didn't pay attention version of everything that we were talking about, you know, these are 3 questions that every single BuzzFeed content creator asks themselves when they're making something for any reason. Would I share this? And the I for your purposes doesn't have to be you. It can be anybody, your target audience. Would they be happy to put this on their Facebook page, or would they just be embarrassed to show this to someone? Is it human? Does it have that voice that's relatable, that speaks to them in a conversational way? And the key, is it relevant? Not just to today, but is it relevant to someone's life in some way? Does it have that identity that speaks to them? Does it have emotion? Does it provide some interesting information? If the answer to all of these is yes, then you probably have a winning piece of content. So that's it for me. I hope we still have time for questions, and yeah, we'll pass it back to Liam, who can facilitate that.
Thank you very much, Joe. That was superb, and I appreciate. I apologize to everyone for the slight interruption that we had earlier. We did check with IT. It turns out that the sheer magnificence of Marcus's hair actually caused that. So it really is tremendous. You have to see it. So we actually ran a little bit over than we expected. So we're not going to have as much time for questions. We do have a lot of questions. So what we're probably going to do is we're probably going to aggregate these and actually send out a follow-up afterwards. But I will try and take whatever I can find in here. So just one that is coming up a lot actually is just about emotional factors. So there was some mention there about how millennials tend to share with emotional content. And is there anything outside of emotional factors that contributes to that? I'll leave that up in the air, whether it's Marcus or Joe wants to take that one.
Yeah, Joe, if you don't mind, I'll jump in first, and then you can hop in as well on it.
Go for it.
Yeah, so perfect question. There were actually some more factors that weren't on one of the slides that we presented. They didn't quite ladder up as high as something that they believed in or that they had emotion about, but we think are still really relevant factors to getting people to share content. So there's three of them here that I have that I'll reference. The first one is, and I think it ladders up perfectly to the last point on Joe's here, is it's relevant to their friends. So 51% of people said that, of millennials that is, if they thought it's relevant to their friends, they're going to share that piece of content. So you want to think about their broader network too. Think in terms of like lookalike audiences. So figure out not just who your target audience is, but then who are they engaging with and who are they interacting with, because it's not always people exactly like them. So that's also something to keep in mind when you're creating that content. The other two things are current events. For 35% of them said that they'd share it if it was around current events. So be nimble. It's a little bit of the real-time marketing methodology, but be quick to react and to have witty comments and be funny or whatever it is about some event that's recently happened or that is going on. And it could be, like I said, witty or funny, or it could be all the way down to that deep level, like I said, about causes that they care about, such as LGBT issues that have recently happened. And then the last one that I'll hit on before throwing it over to Joe is original content. 32% said they'd be likely to share it more if it was original content. So, like I said, create some custom content, create some bite-sized stuff that's specific to you. And if you're a small team, leverage other people at your company. I think that's one of the most common places that people don't look for content creation efforts, and that's other employees at the company. And every email you send, every time you send a link out, Twitter, email, Facebook, whatever it is, that's like content marketing. So take a look at that and think, well, would my audience also be interested in this? And if so, go ahead and share that out, because it's likely something that's going to resonate as well. And then I'll toss it over to Joe for a few more. I'm sure he's got some stuff.
Yeah, so emotion is like salt. It shouldn't be the base of your content. When you're thinking about what kind of stories that you can create for your brand, you don't want to start with emotion that doesn't relate to the brand in any way. So you have to start somewhere where you're telling stories that feels relevant not just to your target audience, but relevant to the brand as well. Because as we mentioned before, millennials can kind of sniff out that false voice from a mile away. You want to be authentic in the stories you're telling. But then the emotion is really the seasoning that you put onto that story. How do you craft a voice that's a little bit more human, a little bit more relatable, and more likely to start a conversation? And when you create that piece of content that's relevant to the brand, relevant to the target, and you sprinkle on just the right amount of emotion and human relevance, then you have a really winning piece of content. Yeah, that's what I would say.
So it appears that we have a lot of B2B attendees on the webinar, and there's a lot of conversations coming up about, so there's a lot of sort of personal connection with millennials, but how do you tie that to B2B content, particularly things that might be in, we'll say like finance or pharmaceutical, or in an industry that is not particularly, we'll say, conducive to emotional content? How would you suggest building content that is shareable for millennials?
Cool. Well, I'll take this first if you don't mind, Marcus.
Mm-hmm.
So the way that I think about the emotion, identity, information thing is it's a triangle, and you can move anywhere within that triangle and lean really heavily into any side of it. but you don't want to occupy any point, and you don't want to go outside of it. So you always want to have a little sprinkling of at least two of those things in your content. So for B2B stuff, I would consider, who are we really trying to talk to here, and what's going to resonate with them most? A lot of clients that we've worked with that have run B2B campaigns lean really heavily into emotion and identity, knowing that millennials who feel really passionate about their careers tend to gravitate towards thought leadership pieces and things about innovation, webinars that are hosted by dashingly handsome men who talk about how to make great content, things like that. And when you're talking about creating content in that space, also think about where B2B conversation happens in the social space. So maybe it's not as much Facebook as it is writing articles on LinkedIn. One of the things I always found interesting about LinkedIn is that people love to write their own thought leadership pieces on there and blast them out, and brands are picking up on this and occupying the space as well to talk about things that are innovative and thought leadership but to speak to a much different audience. So I would say boil it down to think about what it is that target is interested in, and if it's another business, where is the conversation happening? Where's the conversation that you want to be a part of, and learn from that?
I think we probably have time for maybe one more question. One that seems to be a very common theme throughout this is the future and what lies ahead. So you did a really good job, Joe, of sort of presenting the state of the industry right now. Where do you see future opportunities? What do you see the trends pointing towards in the future?
Great question. Really great. The question used to manifest itself in what comes after social, which is a joke that we have here at BuzzFeed. What comes after social, Jonah? But I think what we're going to see a lot more is that the brands out there who are trying to change the story in a way that feels inauthentic are going to have a really tough time doing that. And brands who have an authentic voice are going to start to really shine in the content space. And I think the future is brands teaming up with publishers of content to create great things and bring that content to people with a lot of relevance. Some brands will probably take that publishing in-house, and we're seeing this as a trend already. But I also think that publishers that are thinking in terms of powering the individual pieces of content rather than one whole publishing unit are going to win. And so when you're thinking about creating any sort of publishing arm, or you want to be crafting content, don't think about building a newspaper. Think about building the best B page possible, because in today's digital distribution landscape, the B page, as it's sometimes referred to, the individual content article page, is actually the A page. And if you optimize that for moving through the social space as quickly as possible, you're going to win.
Yep, and just to quickly add on that, Liam, before we wrap up, I think the point Joe brought up about brands kind of becoming publishers is probably the main trend that we see moving forward, and really that's the gist of what content marketing is. We just had a dinner a few months ago here in the UK where we talked about and had a brand editor come and speak, and it's just really dynamic, because even with a team that's relatively small, not a lot of resources dedicated, you can have a pretty huge impact on the business. So I think over time you'll see a lot more brands kind of migrating to that area of play. And then I think the other thing you see is obviously just the brands and the publishers converging pretty rapidly, and more brands and more publishers being willing to experiment with each other and mix and match. I think just 2 or 3 days ago now, you had GoPro announce that they're going to start licensing their video content out from some of their top creators. So, brand video, I think, has always been a big issue for brands, and obviously BuzzFeed's seen a lot of success with that. And now you have these tools coming out that are going to make it easier for your brand to have really authentic stuff because it's made by individuals. It's that UGC side, generated content. So I think the UGC stuff and then just the brands and publishers converging are probably some of the major trends that we see moving forward.
Thanks, Marcus. So I think we're actually about to wrap it up. There's a lot of questions just about getting a copy of this deck, and we will be following up with a copy of the recording and a copy of the deck, so we will make sure that everybody gets one of those. And so I just want to say thanks to Joe and to Marcus for putting on a great webinar, and thanks to everybody for attending. It was very insightful. So have a good day, and thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everybody.